and to all participants here. Also to my colleagues who have, during the years, been hearing me a number of times deconstructing this scene to death from various angles. I have a feeling that every conference we do, I return to that for a reason. And there's a series of publications trying to do that in print too. My work goes back to Zorba often, trying also not to talk about only the film, but also of the cultural representations that spring out of that and after it, but also about how we can return to Kazantzakis and rethink his work through that experience, perhaps the experience of that dance. This is what I will do today as well. That is, if I get it right. Page first. Okay. In the end of Michael Kakoyannis' film, this very last scene of Zorba the Greek from 1964, a year after Seferis' Nobel Prize, I should remind you, in a scene following its novelistic origin to the letter, even if with a slightly more contained eroticism, the two central characters of the novel, the boss and Zorba, drink, exchange gazes and niceties as they start dancing on a seashore, which handily happens to be empty. Just before that scene, the air train operation that both characters had tried to pull together had spectacularly failed, for those of you who have read both novel and seen the film. And along with that failure, along with it, so had the bigger than life, larger than life plans of the boss to create a mine on that Cretan shore. Yet at the moment when everything has collapsed, the earthly Zorba and the bookish boss start dancing slowly, but then in a faster tempo that becomes faster and faster, in order to also give the cultural spectacle that you all are very well aware of. They do dance in a rhythm that seems to be their own. The music is heard in their minds, you have to assume, a rhythm that is only their own. As you have heard, the boss says, "Teach me to dance." Zorbas replies, "Did you say dance?" Then he pulls his. "Come on, boy, let's go." Then taran, taran, tarantatan, as you heard. "Yasu levedimu." "Boss, I've so much to tell you. I've never loved a man more than you," etc., etc. The rest is history. On the one hand, there may have been a financial disaster, frustration and disappointment, but on the other hand, at least this is what the film says, the most important thing is to find yourself, to let yourself feel and let go. It is a lesson that has since haunted not only this film or the novel of which it was an adaptation, but also a certain attitude to the Greek world. A little wine, a little sea, and a friend, with a round of sirtaki to finish it off. Yet notice how the camera, and alongside it the gaze of the viewer, follow the scene from some distance, and then go even further. A medium-length shot, then a long shot, which also moves upwards, resembling a crane shot. The gaze of the viewer, in other words, after watching this scene in its local context, is now ready to fly, leaving behind it this sweet mise-en-scène on the deserted Cretan beach. Music and titles, end of the film. Who does it want to show? Whose gaze is it incorporating? What type of cultural poetics does this camera stand for? This camera that surveys, nostalgically contemplates, and then starts leaving in the end of Zorba the Greek. It is not a rhetorical question. As there, in the end of Zorba, what's being crystallized is the cultural logistics of a whole era. And as I will argue in the remaining of this short paper, this is a cultural logistics that is larger than this film, larger than its director and stars. Greek and global culture or Kazantzakis himself. Like an erotic encounter that has the power, if done correctly, to change things around it, after that dance, nothing will be the same again. But let us start taking things from the beginning. In the novel Βίος και Πολιτεία του Alexis Zorba, as we have already heard from Professor Beaton, the intellectually, nationally, and personally perplexed, as well as creatively challenged boss, whose first name we will never hear in the whole novel, or we don't, I think, hear in the film either, decides to go to Crete in order to start a lignite mine. On the way, he meets the full of life, deep human experience and human wisdom, Zorba, who becomes his right-hand man and novelistic partner. Approach, mutual exploration, feeling, travel, understanding, and the bringing together of opposites. The authentic popular soul and the intellectual will go like that throughout the book, as you know. They are the two opposites, and they somehow meet. Sorry. Come on. They will go on like that in what will eventually become an exchange of what they have to give to each other. The former, that is, Zorba, will provide popular feeling, authenticity. The latter will transcribe this into novelistic discourse, an exercise of balance and syncretism and Greekness. 20 or so years later, Kakoyannis' film will rework the main axis of this story, giving them a new dynamic. Zorba the Greek will start as a film where one man, scared, throws his gaze around him, trying to find his way. For those of you who haven't seen the film, he goes to Piraeus. He's very scared. Alan Bates, the boss, who, even though perhaps of Greek origin, does not really speak Greek in the film, arrives, apart from some words, arrives in the harbor of Piraeus in a rainy afternoon. The gaze he projects and the gaze he receives is that of the strangers, the outsider. He is both looking as a stranger and is being looked at as a stranger. Enter Zorba, in the form and appearance of the Mexican-American Anthony Quinn. It is then a moment when everything starts changing, or rather starts getting translated. The austere gazes start relaxing, the serious faces start laughing, and this is not only Zorba and the boss that start doing that, but if you watch again the film, everybody around starts getting mellower. This is the moment when translation starts, and the journey starts acquiring some sort of meaning and direction. From its first scenes, where the first clumsy translations take an almost symbolic weight, that is, translations between Zorba and the boss, between the boss and the rest of the people, they start becoming almost symbolic. Up to its last scene of that dance, where Queen, in a mixture of English and Greek that you have just heard, incites Bates to dance and share a language. I have so much to tell you, he says. Zorba becomes a film on understanding and translating, or rather, a film on translatability, the strategies, that is, that render people, things, and situations translatable. And this is not a small thing, as the issue of translation keeps resurfacing, haunting the narrative and every visual aspect of that film. In the film's most memorable moments, for instance, those scenes where Queen is dancing before that final double dance, when the boss is mostly watching with our eyes wide open, but also in the main device of the script, still translation, with the Bates character not speaking Greek, everything needs to be translated within the film's narrative, within the camera's frame. This is a handy device. The film can be watched by a global audience without the need of subtitles. Even the few Greek phrases that the characters utter can be eventually inferred from context. Yet, if you come to think about it, even a non-Anglophone audience could watch the film based on simple tourist English, and its willingness the audience's willingness, that is, to enter the game of translation and translatability that this film thematizes and plays with from the beginning. If the first axis of the film is translatability, the second axis is that of movement, transfer, and visit. The film starts in a harbor cafe full of people ready to travel, and from that moment on, keeps focusing on what it means to visit and or inhabit in a strange, hostile, enclosed world in the rough Cretan landscape that's become, I think, rougher by the use of white and black photography. Zorba the Greek is a story of movement and transfer which expands from the harbor of Piraeus all the way to the stories Madame Hortense tells her guests, or the whole enterprise concerning the air shuttle, again, movement and transfer, that Zorba spends most of the film and the novel trying to put together. The story of movement and transfer, however, especially because the story is taking place in a small enclosed Greek village where the locals do not travel, they cannot move, and you know how this ends tragically with the stoning of the widow. Because the locals cannot travel, this story becomes, little by little, a story not so much of transfer and movement, but of visit, if not visitation. From a narrative of cultural mobility, therefore, that story of I am going to make a mine, Zorba becomes a story of reachability and transferability. But if translatability and transferability have been the two first axes of the film, the third one follows directly from them as much as it also follows from the core of the novel. This axis is that of authenticity, or rather, of an authenticity that can become the basis of dialogue, an authenticity that can be communicated to the other. As in the novel, so in the film. The boss is mesmerized by Zorba's authenticity and sits down to write and transform or transubstantiate, if you want, this story into art, this meeting into art. But what is being underscored even further in the film is the idea of an authentic self that you can give and take, an exchangeable authenticity. As Queen and Bates start dancing in those last shots of Zorba the Greek, what the viewers are invited or to see is not the sudden release of a boss who, in the midst of loss and defeat, decides to imitate the dance of his worker. What they're invited to watch is someone who, after a process of translation, of transfer and movement, eventually comprehends and becomes able to give an account of and to account for the authenticity of the other, taking a little bit of that authenticity with him in the very end. Someone who exchanges the process through which he has created a fantasy of authenticity with a snippet of experience that is offered to him as part of that authenticity. Those who can take a little theory here can also see it this way. If the construction of authenticity is based on the desire of the other as a whole, this is how we construct authenticity. We want the other as a whole. Exchangeable authenticity takes the formative scene of this fantasy, I desire the other as a whole, and reifies it. It cuts it into pieces. It puts a temporal frame on it. It puts a value on it, as much as it also, it puts a value on it, it times it, as much as it also prices it. Dance the sirtaki and leave your myth in Greece. The camera that starts leaving the place in the end of Zorba the Greek, therefore, is an instrument of the same machinery of transforming the fantasy of taking in otherness into the packaging of experiencing its pieces. The camera in the end of Zorba reminds us of movement, reachability, and transferability. From what we have seen, we as viewers have now to move away, to leave behind, with a sense of nostalgia, yet leave. And I did mention a crane shot. It's almost as if we are taking the aeroplane and going somewhere, And that handling seals exchangeable authenticity. As we see the two gentlemen dancing and negotiating further possibilities, exchangeable authenticity becomes a carte postale, a piece of tourist memorabilia. It takes a setting and a symbolic weight. It takes, that is, a reproducible form. And in the end, with the titles in English on top of the long shot that you have seen, it also takes the price tag of its international production. It should by now be obvious where I come from and where I'm getting at. What makes Zorba so successful in 1964 is, I believe, the fact that it expresses so well tendencies that characterize the wider cultural circulation in post-war globality, reaching a peak in that period we now call the 60s. Translatability, transferability, and authenticity's exchangeability become the modalities based on which a certain culture industry is organized and expands at that time. Music, I remind you, cinema, but also photography, glossy magazines, and other media. And in the same way, in the same machinery, with the same tactics, so do the various national tourist industries, among them Greece's. Yet let us not forget this. These are the very modalities, and at the same time, the very modalities based on which popular culture also develops more generally, including its more radical aspects and forms, what will eventually be called the counterculture. Translatability, transferability, and exchangeability become not only a way to do cultural business, but also the very vocabulary in which to articulate progressive cultural politics. Dylan goes to London and teaches the Beatles how to take drugs. The Beatles go to India, where they are taught the riddle of spirituality and the poses of yoga, or at least some of them. The hippies go to Matala. Jane Fonda goes to Vietnam and becomes Hanoi Jane. And in May 68, 4 years later, nous sommes tous des Juifs allemands. Translation, movement, and the self in exchange. Or rather, the new times of translatability, transferability, and exchangeability. These were the times of Zorba, who can do it, of the boss who may or may not decide to give it a try, of Kazantzakis on the past to uninhibited globality, and of the Greek and of the Greeks, who had, on the Cretan Akroiali and everywhere else, and from that moment on, if not from before, to learn how to do not only everything and everyone that came their way, but also that dance.